The Beyond is partially good sci-fi. First, we will discover the basic concept. Second, we will explore what conflicts arise in this concept. And third, we will explore the third phase of The Beyond, where it goes beyond the solar system. So let's first dive into the concept of The Beyond. It's a sci-fi series about the solar system, about space travel, but not so much space travel as in Star Trek or in Star Wars, more Star Trek like Star Wars, but rather it is about space travel within the solar system. So therefore we have the big players. We have Earth, we have Mars, and we have the Belt. So basically we have three entities which are kind of separate from each other, and therefore over time it seems that separate identities are created. So when it comes to Mars, on Mars were the scientists initially, because on Mars you needed to have certain qualifications to get to Mars, and therefore Mars is kind of the technology power, but it's also not only technology but also military power, because with technology often also comes military superiority. And therefore Mars is kind of the war planet, you could say, but it's not so much the war planet, it's just a little bit because of the technical superiority. Also the problem is that Mars is not Earth, and therefore Mars has not usually, but about 1/3 of the gravity of Earth. This is also a distinction criteria which later on will become important. And the other thing is that Mars is just a dry planet. There is nothing on there. There is no green. There are no lakes, there are no seas, there are no forests, because Mars is just a desert. And this now means that on Mars people long for something better. They long for something better, which is Earth basically, but on Mars. And this is called terraforming, this process of making Mars, turning Mars into something more than it currently is, into something more Earth-like. Terraforming, there are different versions out there, not as specifically explored in The Beyond. You see a few visualizations, things like these. When it comes to the theoretics or how to do something like this, there have been different concepts, one for Venus for example and one for Mars. What I can recommend is there is a video by the YouTube channel Kurzgesagt about terraforming Venus and also shortly Mars, which cover both terraforming processes shortly. It involves nukes, for example, if I remember correctly. So now this is Mars, and now we have the asteroid belt. So basically in the outer solar system there are a lot of rocks flying around. Why do they fly around? For the same reasons all the other rocks in our solar system fly around, also including Earth and Mars, because of the sun's gravity. So the far outer you get, the smaller these planets get. Of course you have the main planets of the solar system, but you also have these small asteroids. Asteroids. I don't specifically know how to pronounce it in English, so therefore let's just keep with what I said or how I pronounce it. The idea is that there are minerals out there and also resources which are worth mining. Therefore, the mining belt is mining resources and delivering them to Mars and also to Earth. And the mining belt is not a nation on its own. So therefore we have a kind of classic conflict, not classic conflict, but a classic separation of classes, because the mining workers maybe are not as skilled, or they are just mining workers. And then you have, and this is also kind of displayed in the movie, the mining workers have crappy ships. They drive around sometimes in their own ships and sometimes going through asteroids and seeing if there is something on there or trying to catch them. And on Mars we have kind of the Mars Society. I think the Mars Society actually on Earth already exists. Nevertheless, this is something different. And on Earth we have classic Earth. Also Earth is kind of weird. Why? Because for the first few episodes of the series we constantly see these very nice buildings on Earth. Basically the UN buildings where political decisions are made. So the Earth in The Beyond is governed by the United Nations, and in these United Nations there is kind of a chancellor, if I understood it correctly. And this chancellor basically rules over Earth, you could say. And this chancellor is a woman for the most time of the series. So now we have these three separate identities, and therefore we are already in the second point of this video. What problems may arise? I already mentioned kind of the classic class conflict, and this not only plays out in kind of a Marxistic, communistic, not really communistic, but Marx coined the idea that there are different classes, and for all of history, the upper classes revolution basically start revolutions in order to gain more rights and also more freedom and things like these. So there is almost always in history a separation between the classes. For example, if you take a look at antique Greek or Greece, antique Greece, then what you find is that there are normal civil, so normal people basically, which have normal rights, and then there are slaves, and also women don't usually have rights also in the antique civilizations. So what you now find is that throughout history, and this is what Marx kind of realized, that throughout history you had of maybe this class fight. It is just that throughout history it never really ended in something that is the big equalizer, where everybody is the same. And this is also kind of the idea behind communism, that everybody is the same. So when it comes to now identity politics, this is a huge problem, that not everybody is the same. But as a matter of fact, not everybody is the same. And even if you try to standardize things like looks, height, income, it becomes very complicated really quick, because what happens if you just work an hour more a week? What happens then if you earn more? And things like these. So about how close to reality something like this is, a system like this is another discussion. Let's go back to the Beyond. In the Beyond, basically, the Belters don't have their own sovereign state. Mars is a sovereign state, and also Earth is a sovereign state, even though it's not a sovereign state, but a sovereign planet. And since the Belt is kind of just a mining operation, it doesn't have its sovereign identity, which becomes a problem because the Belters identify themselves as Belters because of the geographic distance to Mars and also to Earth. Think about how long it would take just to travel there, and even without light speed. Not even without light speed, this sentence didn't really make sense, because with light speed, of course, it would be much quicker. Because if you take a look at light speed, it takes roughly 8 minutes for the light from the sun to Earth, for example, just as a comparison. And the Earth is pretty close to the sun. But usually you don't have light speed, and also in the Beyond, I don't think we have light speed all the time. At least it doesn't seem that way. So, but I could be wrong on this one, on the Lightspeed one, but I'm not entirely sure. There is an episode though where the warp drive is essentially kind of created. So we see the creation of the warp drive. It's just that the creator cannot stop the ship, and therefore he basically either explodes or he just drives into space. I cannot remember. So now, back to identity politics. The Belt wants to create his own state eventually, and therefore throughout the series, there is always this, we are the Belters, we deserve something different, this narrative. And for the first part, the representative of the Belt is kind of Fred Johnson, general that fell into disgrace after he was accused of basically shooting a lot of miners who wanted better working conditions, and therefore held a mining factory, not factory, but a mining place hostage. So therefore, but he actually didn't know something which comes only up later in the series. Therefore, I think he thought there were no people in there or something like this. So this is the first part of the series where Fred Johnson is kind of not really the government, but kind of the executive party that kind of reigns on the Belt, or at least speaks as a representative of the Belt. And when it comes to Mars, there is not really somebody who we know from the beginning, because we deal with all these things in space most of the time. And when it comes to Earth, we have the Chancellor, which is the woman. So now, I cannot remember her name. So when these two different parties then clash in different points throughout the series, it comes to conflict. And this is essentially what the second part of the video is. Now the third part of the video. What is the third part of the video? In order to understand the third part of the video, we also have to understand kind of the plot until this part of the series where we begin to explore extra solar space, you could say. So within the first part of the series, it's basically around the belt, around Mars and around Earth. And there is now something entering the solar system, which is the protomolecule. The protomolecule is something that is kind of organic, and it creates life. It is life. It also is kind of you could say like a beehive. It has kind of a common intelligence, and it's also works as a parasite on humans, and that's one of the reasons it becomes so scary in the beginning. So it kind of evolves people or humans into something else, which becomes of course a problem because it acts also as a virus. Nevertheless, so this is the first part of the series. So now the main protagonist, James Holden, encounters the protomolecule, and there is an incident in the beginning, and throughout the first part of the series, James Holden kind of haunts the protomolecule and wants to destroy it throughout the galaxy. And the different parties have different opinions, and everybody thinks that they need to understand this technology, this new thing, because it could give them an edge in the maybe Cold War that is basically in front of them or already happening. So now that concludes the first part of the series. James Holden is not successful, and James Holden also has a crew, and they are not successful in getting rid of the protomolecule. So now the third part of the series would be the part that would be very interesting, but it isn't, because after the first plot, it becomes really boring, and that's sad, because it had a strong start, even though it had the classic series characteristics such as long editing and also just long conversations and boring stuff in between we don't necessarily need to know about. So therefore, now the third part of the series, what happens in the third part of the series? The protomolecule is actually something that is created or was created by someone. And now there is something else, and this something else is not really separated from the protomolecule all the time, so it's kind of a mixture in between the protomolecule and the something else. So the idea is that the something else is kind of the enemy, the common enemy, because it destroyed the creators of the protomolecule. Whether the protomolecule is evil or not is something that is explored throughout the series, but it basically just is. And the same also is true for the other one, and the other one doesn't really have a name, it's just the thing that destroyed the creators. And it's kind of similar to Prometheus, where there were also mysterious creators in the beginning that in the end we kind of find out. So, well, that's the similarity between Prometheus and also the Beyond. When it comes to the enemies now, so this other thing that maybe destroyed the protomolecule, it creates a portal. And this portal is basically an entry. And then within this entry, it's basically a sphere. And it has one entry. And then all over the sphere are entries into other points of our universe. And these points are inhabitable planets, actually. So James Holden and his crew drive in, and now there are also other parties involved. Basically, again, the Belters, who have now a ship. And, well, there is also somebody else who wants a separate identity for the Belters and who starts again a revolution, but he doesn't really succeed, and he also has kind of shady motives. So therefore, this is kind of the side plot. And this is also the boring side plot. This is basically the same plot as in the beginning, just with lighter motives, just with more black and white motives. It's clear that he is kind of evil. You could say it's not that he's evil, he just wants to have it for his personal self-confirmation. And that's something that becomes boring really quick. At least for me, it became boring really quick, and I basically didn't really want to finish the series. I finished it, but well, it was just boring in the end. That's just, at least for me. So what happens is that they explore these planets, and they also realize over time that this portal is created by this other entity, the ring entity. I think it's called the ring entity. And the ring entity basically can destroy a ship at any point in time if it, for example, is too fast, if it enters the phase too fast. Also, space and time are kind of warped in this entity, so within the sphere, and that concludes the third chapter of this video. So the interesting part, the part that would be very interesting, of course, the idea also that we just explore the solar system in the beginning is also a very good concept. And focusing on the solar system actually gives the whole thing a vibe of reality, because the ships don't look very spacey in terms of, you know, I guess what I mean. So therefore, they don't really look futuristic. It's a future that could happen within the next 10, 20, 50, of course not really 10, because if you take a look at what is planned right now, probably not, but within the next century, for example, things like these could happen. We could establish bases on, we could establish, for example, a moon. So there's actually a complete, I cannot remember if it's a second moon, because I watched it a few, I think 2 months back or something like this. But there is also Luna, which is moon, and I think there is, yeah, it's the normal moon just with a moon base basically, so they have habitats on top of the moon. And the same is true for the other moons in the solar system. So there is Ceres, for example, or other moons in the solar system that have also habitats on them. But again, it's just a desert, just like Mars, because they sometimes have habitats, of course, because they need to establish ecosystems there with oxygen and with carbon dioxide. But the problem obviously is that they cannot really at least up until the point where we visit the Beyond, or the timeline of the Beyond, they don't terraform anything yet. That concludes the Beyond. It's a very interesting series. It's one of the best sci-fi series I've watched. Of course, Star Trek is also really good. I wouldn't necessarily consider Star Wars a sci-fi series, because it is much more grounded, I think. Even though obviously it is sci-fi. It's just, compared to Star Trek, it's just so much less sci-fi, if this makes sense. Star Wars is basically just knights in space, you could say. And Star Trek is about the whole futuristic thing about, oh, there is this other series I will also soon make something about. It's called Foundation, a series originally written by Isaac Asimov, one of the biggest names in sci-fi writing.